So I'm delighted to be with you this afternoon. We're living in really exciting times, and one of the major things that excites me in particular is that we're living at a time of unprecedented change in terms of our understanding of ourselves and our place in the world. And so for the next 15 minutes, we're going to be exploring the transformation in our understanding of the so-called hard problem of consciousness. So theologians and philosophers have been asking questions like, what exactly is consciousness? What's it for? What's the point in our existence? They've been asking these questions for centuries. But it's only recently that neuroscientists have been able to join in the study of consciousness. And that's because there's been a revolution in technologies that are allowing us to peer into the brain as never before. So we can now watch the zip of electricity as a new creative idea sparks to life in somebody's brain. We can actually watch as new roadways are constructed and forged within our minds so that we can have new thoughts that then become new habits in our behavior. We're able to watch our brain with high resolution and in real time in conscious, living mammals as they navigate their way through space, and as they feel the myriad of emotions and thoughts and associations that make all of their lives unique. And this new way of looking at ourselves, this new voyeurism, is really forcing us to ask some very deep questions about what it means to be human and what is the point to us being human. And so to kickstart our exploration of that, I'm going to ask you to listen to this and see if you can make any sense of it. If you could increase the volume, please. So that's pretty much gobbledygook, okay? So the majority of you, maybe you'll try and hear some sense in it, but mostly it's just gobbledygook. Now listen to this second sentence. See if you can understand this.
The camel was kept in a cage at the zoo. The camel was kept in a cage at the zoo.
Okay, poor camel. Poor camel. I'm hoping it's a big cage. We're now going to return to the original audio file, and I promise you it is the original audio file. See if you can make sense of it. Suddenly it makes sense. So your brain has overlaid that sense of the camel being kept in the cage at the zoo over the sentences of gobbledygook, which have a very similar cadence. And your brain has suddenly transformed the way that it understands that gobbledygook. And this is really kind of getting to the nub of what it means to be conscious. So it's generally agreed, it's been debated, but it's generally agreed that consciousness is our ability to form a subjective view of the world. And our brain does this on a constant basis. It uses all of its prior experiences in order to inform how it forges its current sense of reality. And that audio illusion was one example of how quickly your brain does this. So forevermore now, when you hear that sentence, the camel was kept in the cage of the zoo, and when you hear the gobbledygook sentence, you will always overlay the sense of it. Now, if you imagine that each one of you has a very unique set of prior experiences, there's some shared commonalities between you, but really speaking, you each individually have experienced very different sets of experiences throughout your life. And all of that gives rise to the unique, subjective way that you form your consciousness, your sense of reality for today. And it's that sense of reality that you have in the today, which then goes on to inform how you make your decisions and your choices throughout your life. And so you can start to see how we each have such individual realities. So neuroscience is now allowing us to look into the brain to see how those subjective views of the world are formed. And there's some, I think this is, so I did my PhD on this type of topic. It was quite a long time ago now, 15 years ago. And this area has really fascinated me since I started studying it. And I've been very fortunate that I've been living and researching at a time when there's been such an explosion in terms of neuroscience knowledge thanks to these amazing technologies. But what we now know is that our consciousness is generated thanks to these 86 billion nerve cells that live in your brain. So 86 billion nerve cells, that's a huge number. It's quite a difficult number to kind of get your head around. But if you imagine that I kind of drilled into your head and sucked out a small bit of your brain tissue about the size of a sugar grain, there'd be about 10,000 nerve cells in there. Now, each one of those nerve cells look a little bit like this. They've got this cell body here with the nucleus in it, with the DNA, and then extending out from that cell body is this long cylindrical structure, which is a little bit like a tree trunk, and it's studded with pores that basically pump sodium and potassium ions in and out of that tree trunk-like structure. And then extending out from that tree trunk are these arbors or branches. And these branches basically allow each one of these 86 billion nerve cells that live in your brain to connect with up to 10,000 other nerve cells. And the sodium and potassium ions being pumped in and out of this axon tree trunk structure basically causes the zip of electricity to run from one end of the nerve cell to another end of the nerve cell at speeds of about 120 miles an hour, and then zip along to the next connection within the circuit that makes up your mind. So basically, your mind is formed of an electrochemical circuit with about 100 trillion connections in it, and it's that circuit that allows you to take information in from the outside world, make sense of it, and then try and direct you to change the world around you through directing your muscles to move so that you can speak to other people or so that you can change the world by moving things in it. And so that's kind of basically the point of your existence, some might say. So how exactly do we form our unique consciousness, our unique subjective view of the world? Well, there's these beautiful things called dendritic spines that occur within your brain. So as you learn something new, a new connection forms from one nerve cell to another nerve cell. And as that learned thing is consolidated into a memory, lots of proteins get recruited to the kind of end of that new little worm-like structure that's forming out. And so the worm-like structure becomes engorged, it grows and forms what's called a mushroom-shaped dendritic spine. And that's basically a memory spine. And you have a unique set of these spine connections within your brain. And that's why you have this unique scope for a very individual life and sense of memory and sense of emotions and way that you interact with the world. This is a movie of so this is using new technologies. This is peering into a slice of brain tissue and seeing as these proteins that are involved in making memory spines get shuttled along the branches in the nerve cells so that new memories can be created. And this is occurring within your brains as you're learning this at the moment, to go and change and inform your sense of reality and your decisions in future days. So I find this personally mind-blowing. I think it's wonderful. So despite this sophisticated way that the brain operates, with this high amount of plasticity and flexibility, and this phenomenal processing power, your brain actually consumes about 20% of your daily energy quota, but it only weighs about 2% of your total body mass. So it's a really greedy, hungry beast, your brain. And a lot of that energy is going towards making that electric signal and then allowing it to be passed and shuttled along throughout your circuitry in your brain. Because of the way that your brain has been designed, the way that it's evolved, there's a trade-off between how fast it can process information and how it sometimes kind of takes shortcuts in information processing. It makes assumptions based on your prior experiences. And there's a really neat little kind of illusion that helps to illustrate that. So if you look at this, this is a video of a rotating mask. So this is Charlie Chaplin kind of being spun round. And if we get to the back end of the mask, you probably won't see it as the back end of a mask. So even though the shadows are telling you that the eyes and the nose are pointing backwards, you are so used to seeing faces rather than the back end of a hollow mask that you ignore those shadow cues and instead see it as a face pointing out with a convex configuration of the eyes and the nose, as you would usually see. There's another more extreme version of this. So again, you're using your prior experiences in order to just make the assumption, to take shortcuts in your processing and make the assumption that you're seeing another face rather than the back end of a mask. So this type of illusion can really help to show how biases can occur in the world, how people can have very different perceptions of the world based on their past experiences. And they're making assumptions based on their past experiences, which may not actually be 100% accurate. And it's just a trade-off for the way that our brains have evolved to work so that we can process the onslaught of information that's coming at us from the outside world in order to make sense of the world in a second-by-second reality and inform that reality to make our future choices in life. So some people, unfortunately, because of this kind of shortcut within our brain, this system within our brain that allows us to have our consciousness, but at the same time also means that we make assumptions, sometimes faulty assumptions about the world. Unfortunately, this process also allows people to get stuck into negative ruminating loops of thinking. So, for example, some people might have obsessive-compulsive disorder, or they might have particular behavioral habits that they find very difficult to get out of. For example, addiction problems or post-traumatic stress disorder, for example. So is there anything that we can use from our increased knowledge of neuroscience in order to combat that? Well, there's been some really interesting research recently looking at microdosing and how taking small doses of LSD or psychedelics can actually help improve creativity. And there's been some wonderful studies that have been conducted just down the road at Imperial College London looking at the effects of small doses of LSD on volunteers' brains. So you can see on the left-hand side here, there's somebody that's been given a small amount of LSD and their whole brain has lit up. If you then map the activity in their brain and turn it into a connectivity map, you can actually see that there's vast amounts of connectivity in activity between the different areas of the brain. This is a volunteer that's just been given a placebo injection. So they think they might have been given LSD, but you're seeing much less connectivity and much less activity. And it's really interesting because scientists have been doing some clinical trials, and they're in very early stages at the moment, but it seems as though small doses of LSD, psychedelics, might be able to help treat people that have these conditions where they are stuck in this assuming way of life. So they're kind of very much stuck in that unfortunate side effect of being conscious, if you will. So is there anything that you can do if you're thinking about boosting your consciousness, but you're not interested in taking psychedelics? Well, this is the question that I ask myself as well. So we are not really the humble sea squirt, I like to think. So I don't know whether you've heard of the humble sea squirt. It kind of lives in the ocean. It's a beautiful little organism. It lives in the ocean, and it kind of wanders around in the currents of the sea until it finds a nice rock that it decides that it wants to settle on. And then once it's found that rock, it actually starts to digest its own brain. It eats its own nervous system. It doesn't need it anymore. It just sits happily on that rock, eating its brain, and then once it's at its brain, it just eats bits of food that happen to kind of drift past in the ocean currents. The sea squirt's asexual, so it's quite happy by itself. Now, I like to think that I am not a sea squirt, and the majority of people around me are also not sea squirts. And instead, we are these conscious living beings, that although we have these inherent faults within our brains that give rise to our consciousness, there's a way that evolution has very cleverly helped to circumnavigate these faults within our brain. And that is by providing us with this beautiful system that keeps us motivated, this beautiful reward circuitry within our brain that basically motivates us to go out and explore the world around us and to exchange ideas and to discuss different ways of thinking with other people. And there's been some really beautiful studies by Professor Chris Frith, who's again in London at University College London, and he's been looking at how something that we probably already intuitively know is that if we discuss our own flawed versions of reality with other people, we are more likely to come together and get a grip on a more real version of reality than if we were living in isolation. And I think that's a beautiful thought and something that I really want to close this talk on, alongside the idea that if you're interested in consciousness, then please do have a look at my book. And we may have also think that we have this sovereignty over nature, that humans are really special. But actually, as we start to understand more about the neural underpinnings of consciousness and how it's generated, we can start to see how other organisms, how other animals, and how other even plants exhibit some absolutely fantastic conscious ways of thinking themselves. And on that point, I'm going to leave you with the sound of this, which is a rat laughing in anticipation of being tickled. Quite a nice noise, isn't it? The sound has been transduced so that the human ear can hear it. But that's the rats waiting to be tickled. Thank you.